There is a patch of dry, cracked earth in southern Iraq, not far from the banks of the Euphrates, where the wind moves over mounds of dust that used to be palaces. Nobody who walks there today would guess that beneath their feet lies the wreckage of the first cities the world ever knew. Somewhere in those mounds, there is a tablet that describes a king who wept because his city had vanished. He was not wrong to weep. Every single city we are about to walk through together tonight rose so high that its people believed it would last forever, and every single one of them fell, some slowly, worn down over centuries, others in a single terrible season. Settle in, because we are going to move slowly through all of it, one city at a time, starting with the very first place on earth that its own people ever dared to call a city. The first city that ever was. Long before anyone had a word for civilization, there was a small settlement near the edge of the marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers used to spill out toward the Persian Gulf. The land there was flat and warm, and the water that came down from the northern mountains carried thick, dark silt that made the soil rich enough to farm without much effort. People had been living in small huts along the riverbanks for generations, but sometime around the middle of the 6th millennium before our era, something changed. A community began to grow at a site the people would come to call Eridu, and it did not stop growing for a very long time. The Sumerians themselves, thousands of years later, remembered Eridu as the first city on earth, the place where kingship was said to have descended from the heavens before it was carried elsewhere. That memory was kept alive in a text scholars now call the Sumerian King List, a strange document that blends real history with legend so thoroughly that untangling the two is still a challenge for historians today. But even without the myth, the physical evidence backs up the idea that Eridu was something special. Beneath the ruins of its temple, archaeologists found layer after layer of smaller shrines, each one built directly on top of the last, stretching back further and further in time. It was as if generation after generation of Eridu's people kept rebuilding the same sacred spot, refusing to let it go, adding a new floor rather than starting fresh somewhere else. That temple was dedicated to a god named Enki, who the Sumerians believed ruled over fresh water, wisdom, and the strange forces of creation itself. Enki was imagined as a clever, generous figure, quick to trick his fellow gods but always in the interest of protecting humanity. It made a certain kind of sense that the very first city on the floodplain would be devoted to the god of sweet water, because without the rivers, none of this would have been possible at all. For a long time, Eridu thrived quietly. Its people built reed boats to move through the marshes, wove baskets, raised sheep, and farmed barley in fields irrigated by small canals dug from the river. The city was never enormous compared to what would come later, but its temple grew more elaborate with every rebuilding, eventually rising into a raised platform that some researchers consider an early ancestor of the great stepped towers, the ziggurats, that would later define the skyline of Sumerian cities. Priests conducted rituals there meant to keep Enki pleased, to keep the waters flowing, and to keep the harvests coming. For the ordinary people of Eridu, life would have felt stable, even comfortable by the standards of the ancient world. The city sat near enough to the coastline of the Gulf that trade could move in from distant lands, bringing exotic materials that had no local source, things like certain stones and shells that must have travelled a long way to end up in Eridu's homes and graves. But there was already something quietly troubling happening beneath the surface of Eridu's success, something the city's own people could not have fully understood at the time. The coastline was shifting. Over the centuries, the Persian Gulf's shoreline crept further away from the city, and the rivers themselves, restless as they always were on that flat plain, began to wander. Canals silted up. Water that used to reach Eridu's fields with ease had to travel further, and irrigation became a harder task each generation. Slowly, and it truly was slowly, over what would have felt like many, many human lifetimes, Eridu's advantages began to fade. Other settlements nearer to the new paths of the rivers began to grow instead, drawing away trade routes, drawing away migrating families looking for better farmland, and eventually drawing away the very sense that Eridu was the center of anything at all. Modern geological studies of the region help explain why this shift happened at all. The Tigris and Euphrates carry enormous quantities of silt down from the mountains where they originate, and over thousands of years, that silt gradually filled in the head of the Persian Gulf, pushing the actual shoreline further and further southeast of where it had once been during Eridu's earliest centuries. At the same time, the rivers themselves, flowing across such a flat, low-lying plain with very little elevation change to hold them in a fixed course, periodically shifted their channels entirely, sometimes gradually and sometimes quite suddenly during major flood events, abandoning old paths in favour of new ones that could lie a considerable distance away from settlements that had been built specifically to take advantage of the earlier course. A city built directly around a specific bend in the river or a specific point of access to the coastline was, in a very real sense, gambling on a landscape that Sumerian engineers, for all their skill with irrigation canals, ultimately had no ability to control over the very long term. By around 2050 BCE, the temple at Eridu was still standing, still being maintained by devoted rulers who wanted to honour the old traditions, but the city around it had shrunk to something far smaller than its former self. It never suffered a violent conquest the way some of its sister cities would. There was no dramatic siege, no burning walls, no invading army remembered in later poetry. Eridu simply grew quieter with each passing century, its population drifting toward newer, more convenient locations, until eventually the temple itself was abandoned and the sand began to do what sand always does, which is cover over what people leave behind. Even so, the Sumerians who came after never forgot it. Long after Eridu had become a half-buried mound out on the edge of the desert, later kings still travelled there to make offerings, treating the ruins the way people might treat the grave of an ancestor whose name still carried weight even after the person themselves was gone. There is something strangely moving about a city that outlived its own relevance by 1,000 years simply because of the reverence people held for what it used to be. Life inside Eridu, during the centuries when it truly was the centre of the known world, would have moved to a rhythm dictated almost entirely by water. Families rose with the light reflecting off the marsh channels, and much of the working day revolved around the upkeep of small irrigation ditches that carried river water into barley fields. Fishing supplemented the diet heavily, since the marshlands around the city teemed with catfish and other freshwater species, and reeds harvested from those same marshes were woven into nearly everything a household needed, from roofing material to the light, buoyant boats used to move between settlements. Sheep and goats were kept nearby, their wool eventually becoming one of the most important traded goods anywhere in Sumer, a tradition that would only grow more central to the region's economy in the centuries after Eridu's own prominence had faded. The religious life of the city left the deepest impression on later generations. Enki was remembered not simply as a distant, abstract force, but as a strangely approachable god, one associated with cleverness, riddles, and a genuine fondness for human beings, in contrast to some of the more severe or unpredictable deities worshipped elsewhere in the pantheon. Later myths describe him presiding over a kind of underground freshwater ocean called the Abzu, believed to lie beneath the earth itself, and to be the ultimate source of all the fresh water that made life along the rivers possible in the first place. The very name of Eridu's temple complex, the Abzu, directly referenced this belief, tying the city's physical location to a cosmic idea about where life-giving water actually came from. Pilgrims and priests treated the shrine less as a monument to a distant ruler and more as a kind of doorway to the source of existence itself, which may help explain why later kings, long after Eridu had ceased to matter politically, still felt a genuine pull to visit and restore it. While Eridu was fading into memory, something else was rising a short distance away, and it would grow larger and more powerful than anything Eridu's people could have imagined. That city would eventually be ruled by a king whose fame would outlast the empire he built. A king whose story would become one of the most famous ever written down, and whose walls would be remembered for 4,000 years after they were built. Uruk and the walls that would not be forgotten. If Eridu was the quiet, dignified elder of the Sumerian world, Uruk was its restless, ambitious heir. Sometime after 4000 BCE, the settlement that would become Uruk began absorbing nearby villages, merging smaller communities into a single, sprawling urban centre, in a process archaeologists sometimes call Sinoicism, though the Sumerians themselves would simply have understood it as their world becoming a city. By around 3200 BCE, Uruk had grown into something the ancient world had never truly seen before. An urban centre that may have held as many as 40,000 people within its walls, an almost unthinkable number for that era, when most human beings still lived their entire lives in villages of a few hundred. Uruk's growth reshaped everything about how people organised their lives. It was here, more than anywhere else, that the earliest form of writing began to take shape. Officials needed a way to track grain, livestock, labour, and temple offerings across a population too large for anyone to remember by heart, and so they began pressing small marks into wet clay with a cut reed, first simple pictures, then more abstract wedge-shaped symbols that we now call cuneiform. It is a strange thing to consider that writing itself, one of the most consequential inventions in human history, may have first appeared not because someone wanted to tell a story, but because a temple administrator needed to keep count of sheep. The earliest tablets recovered from Uruk are almost entirely administrative in nature. Simple lists recording quantities of grain, numbers of livestock, or amounts of labour owed by particular households to the temple. Reading them today feels less like reading literature and more like flipping through someone's old ledger book, and in a very real sense, that is exactly what they are. It would take several more centuries before this system of marks evolved enough flexibility to record actual language, full sentences capable of expressing law, poetry, or personal correspondence rather than simple lists of goods. But that slow evolution, from simple counting tokens to a full writing system capable of carrying complex ideas across both distance and time, took place substantially within Uruk's own temple precincts, making the city not just Sumer's first true metropolis, but very plausibly the birthplace of literacy itself. Uruk's economic reach extended remarkably far beyond its own walls. Small clay tokens and cylinder seals bearing designs associated with Uruk-style administration have been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away, in parts of what is now Syria, Turkey, and Iran, suggesting that Uruk's cultural and economic influence spread through trade and possibly colonization long before any Sumerian ruler ever attempted outright military conquest of neighboring lands. Merchants and officials associated with the city appear to have established smaller outposts and trading colonies at some of these distant sites, a phenomenon modern archaeologists sometimes describe as the Uruk expansion, representing what may have been one of the very first examples in human history of one city's cultural and economic model being deliberately exported and adopted across a wide surrounding region. The cylinder seals themselves deserve a moment of attention, since they represent a genuinely clever administrative invention in their own right. Carved from small cylinders of stone, each seal bore a unique design that, when rolled across a strip of wet clay, left behind a continuous, repeating image, functioning much like a modern signature or an official stamp to mark ownership, authorize a transaction, or seal a container shut in a way that would visibly show if it had been tampered with along the way. Officials and merchants across Uruk's expanding network carried these seals as personal identification, and the specific artistic style of any given seal can often tell modern archaeologists a great deal about where its owner likely trained, giving researchers a genuinely useful tool for tracing exactly how far Uruk's particular administrative culture had spread across the wider region during this early formative period of Sumerian history. Uruk was home to two major temple complexes, one devoted to the sky god An and another devoted to Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, who was worshipped with a passion that shaped the emotional life of the entire city. Inanna was not a gentle deity in the way some later religious traditions imagined their goddesses. She was described as fierce, unpredictable, capable of great tenderness and great destruction within the same breath. A goddess who could descend into the underworld itself and return changed by what she found there. Her temple, the Iana, became one of the largest and most elaborately decorated religious complexes of its time, filled with cone mosaics pressed into wet plaster in bands of red, black, and white that must have caught the light in ways that felt almost otherworldly to the people who saw them. The technique behind those mosaics involved thousands upon thousands of small fired clay cones, each dipped in coloured pigment at its wide end, pressed point first into wet plaster, covering the temple's mud brick columns and walls until only the coloured bases remained visible, arranged into elaborate geometric patterns of zigzags, diamonds, and triangles. Producing enough cones to decorate an entire temple complex would have required a genuinely enormous coordinated effort, involving potters, plasterers, and labourers working over an extended period, all in service of a decorative technique whose sole purpose was to honour a goddess most Sumerians regarded with equal parts devotion and fear. Excavators recovered so many of these small clay cones from the ruins of the Iana precinct that reconstructing even fragments of the original wall patterns has given modern researchers one of their best surviving glimpses into the visual aesthetic of early Sumerian religious architecture. It was in Uruk that the legendary King Gilgamesh was said to have ruled, sometime around 2700 BCE, though separating the historical man from the myth that grew around him is nearly impossible at this distance in time. Later generations remembered him as part man, part god, a restless and often difficult ruler whose people grew tired of his demands and whose personal grief over losing a close companion sent him on a desperate search for the secret of eternal life. That story, later compiled into what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, became one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature in human history, describing his journeys, his friendships, his failures, and his eventual painful acceptance that immortality was not something available to mortal men. Even the walls of Uruk itself became part of his legend. Ancient texts describe those walls stretching for many kilometers around the city, built of fired brick, and later poets pointed to their sheer scale as proof that Gilgamesh had, in some sense, achieved a kind of immortality after all, since a monument like that could outlive any single human lifetime many times over. The story itself, as it comes down to us through later Babylonian copies of much older Sumerian source material, begins with the gods growing troubled by Gilgamesh's restless energy and his harsh treatment of Uruk's population, so they fashion a wild counterpart for him named Enkidu, a man raised among animals on the open steppe, meant to match his strength and temper his excesses. The two men fight first and become inseparable companions afterward, journeying together to a distant cedar forest to confront its fearsome guardian and later facing the consequences of offending the goddess Inanna, who reacts to a personal insult from Gilgamesh by unleashing a monstrous bull upon the city. Their journey to the cedar forest deserves particular attention because of how much genuine tension the surviving narrative builds around it. The forest's guardian, a fearsome being described as having a voice like thunder and breath capable of scorching flesh, had been placed there specifically by the gods to keep mortals from cutting down the sacred trees within, and Gilgamesh's decision to challenge that guardian anyway reflects the same restless hunger for fame and lasting achievement that drives him throughout the entire epic. Enkidu, who had once lived wild in that very landscape before his transformation into a companion of the king, expresses real fear about the venture, and the pair are described experiencing troubling, prophetic dreams along their journey that Enkidu interprets, with some anxiety, as omens of the danger awaiting them. Their eventual confrontation with the Guardian, and their choice afterward to fell the forest's most sacred trees despite having secured victory, is framed by the narrative as an act of genuine hubris, one that draws direct divine attention to the pair and sets in motion the tragic consequences that follow soon afterward. Returning to Uruk as celebrated heroes, the two men soon find themselves at the center of a second crisis, this time provoked directly by Gilgamesh's own poor judgment. Inanna, struck by his appearance and reputation, proposes marriage to him, an offer Gilgamesh rejects in strikingly harsh terms, listing off a series of her previous lovers and describing the misfortune that supposedly befell each one after the goddess grew tired of them. Furious at the insult, Inanna appeals to her father, the sky god An, demanding he release the bull of heaven to punish the city. The bull's rampage through Uruk causes genuine devastation, described in the narrative as splitting open the earth itself with each stamp of its hooves and swallowing dozens of the city's men into the resulting chasms, before Gilgamesh and Enkidu manage to work together to bring the creature down. Their triumph is short-lived, however, since the gods interpret the killing of the sacred bull, layered on top of the earlier destruction of the cedar forest's guardian, as one offense too many, and it is this accumulated divine anger that the narrative points to as the reason Enkidu alone, rather than Gilgamesh himself, is chosen to die soon afterward. Enkidu's eventual death from illness, which the narrative frames as a punishment handed down by the gods for the pair's earlier actions, devastates Gilgamesh so completely that he abandons his throne and sets out across the world in search of a man named Utnapishtim, said to be the sole survivor of a great flood and the only mortal ever granted eternal life. Along the way, Gilgamesh crosses a range of forbidding landscapes, including mountains guarded by scorpion beings and a stretch of pure darkness that the sun itself travels through each night before finally reaching a tavern keeper who tries gently to persuade him that mortal life, filled with simple pleasures like good food, loved ones, and meaningful work, is the only genuine treasure available to human beings, since immortality belongs to the gods alone. Gilgamesh presses on regardless, eventually reaching Utnapishtim, who recounts his own survival of the Great Flood before revealing, somewhat reluctantly, a plant capable of restoring youth, which Gilgamesh recovers only to have it stolen from him by a serpent while he bathes on his journey home. Gilgamesh's journey to find him, and his eventual failure to secure immortality for himself, forms one of the most quietly devastating meditations on mortality that survives from the ancient world, ending with him returning home to Uruk and, in a sense, finding meaning not in living forever, but in the enduring city he leaves behind. Inanna's presence in Uruk went far beyond a single episode in Gilgamesh's story. She was, by a wide margin, the most beloved and most feared deity in the entire southern plain, and Uruk's identity was bound up with her in ways that other cities' relationships with their patron gods rarely matched. Hymns composed in her honor describe her holding power over love and desire in one hand and the chaos of battle in the other, a goddess capable of turning a man into a woman, elevating a shepherd to kingship, or reducing a proud city to rubble, depending on her mood. One of the most famous myths associated with her describes her deliberate descent into the underworld to challenge her sister, the goddess of death, and her subsequent death and return to the world above. A story later scholars have connected to the seasonal disappearance and return of fertility across the farming calendar. For the people of Uruk, worshipping a goddess this unpredictable was less about seeking comfort and more about seeking protection from forces that could never fully be tamed. A fitting spiritual outlook for a city that itself would spend the next several centuries being conquered, sacked, rebuilt, and conquered again. For centuries, Uruk stood as arguably the most important city in the entire region, a place other rulers measured themselves against. But greatness on that scale draws attention, and attention in the world of early Mesopotamia often turned into rivalry. As other cities across the plain grew in size and confidence, they began to look at Uruk not simply with admiration, but with ambition of their own. One king in particular, ruling from a city called Umma, would eventually claim to have brought Uruk and nearly every other city in Sumer under a single banner, a feat so remarkable that it briefly made him one of the most powerful men who had ever lived. But that is a story for later, because before Umma could rise, another city entirely, one connected to the very beginning of kingship itself, according to Sumerian belief, was already shaping the political world that Uruk and Umma would eventually fight over. Uruk's population would ebb and swell across the centuries that followed, sometimes shrinking under the pressure of war, sometimes swelling again as new rulers restored its temples and its pride. It would be conquered, and it would recover, more times than almost any other Sumerian city, a resilience that in some ways makes its eventual, final decline even sadder than a single dramatic collapse might have been. Before we follow that rivalry any further, though, it helps to understand just what these cities actually believed about the world around them, because almost nothing that happened in Sumer, no war, no treaty, no reform, no collapse, can be fully understood without knowing how deeply religion shaped every decision a Sumerian ruler ever made. The gods who ruled everything. Every Sumerian city we have discussed so far, and everyone we are about to discuss, understood itself first and foremost as the earthly household of a particular god or goddess. The temple was not simply the largest building in the city, it was understood quite literally as that deity's home, with the city's population existing, in the deepest sense of the theology, to serve and provide for their divine resident. Uruk belonged to An and Inanna. Eridu belonged to Enki. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Belonged to the moon god Nanna. This meant that questions we might now think of as purely political, who should rule, how resources should be distributed, whether a war was justified, were, in the Sumerian mind, ultimately questions about divine will, interpreted and administered by the priesthood and the king together. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, with hundreds of named deities recorded across the surviving tablets, though a much smaller core group dominated actual religious life in most cities. An, the sky god, was considered the most senior in rank, though in practice a somewhat distant figure whose authority mattered more symbolically than in daily worship. Enlil, worshipped at Nippur, functioned as the god of wind, storms, and crucially, kingship itself, the deity who actually granted or withdrew the right to rule from the various cities across the plain, depending on how favourably he viewed them at any given moment. Enki, at Eridu, governed wisdom, fresh water, and craftsmanship, often portrayed in myth as clever and mischievous, but fundamentally sympathetic to humanity's struggles. Inanna, beloved at Uruk, but worshipped passionately across the entire region, embodied love, fertility, and the unpredictable violence of war all at once, a combination that must have felt entirely natural to people whose lives were shaped equally by the promise of a good harvest and the constant threat of conflict with a neighbouring city. Beyond these major figures, each city maintained its own smaller pantheon of local gods, ancestral spirits, and protective deities, along with an enormous body of ritual practice designed to keep all of them satisfied. Priests conducted daily offerings of food and drink at the temples, believing quite literally that the gods needed to be fed and cared for in much the same way that any powerful, honored guest would need to be looked after. Temple complexes functioned simultaneously as religious centers, economic hubs, and administrative headquarters, controlling enormous tracts of farmland, herds of livestock, and workshops producing textiles and crafted goods, all technically owned by the resident deity but managed on the god's behalf by an extensive staff of priests and administrators. This blending of religious and economic power is part of why temple archives have provided historians with such a rich record of daily Sumerian life, since the gods' earthly households needed the same kind of careful bookkeeping as any other large enterprise. Beyond the daily offerings, each city followed an elaborate annual festival calendar built around agricultural cycles and important episodes from religious mythology, with certain celebrations drawing crowds from well beyond the city's own walls. One of the most significant of these across Sumer involved a ceremony reenacting the sacred marriage between the city's ruler and the goddess Inanna, symbolically ensuring fertility and prosperity for the land in the year ahead, a ritual that blurred the line between political authority and religious devotion in a way that made the king's role feel inseparable from the well-being of the harvest itself. These festivals gave ordinary residents a break from their usual labor and offered public spectacle, feasting, and music, moments of genuine communal joy woven into lives that were otherwise structured almost entirely around the demands of farming, weaving, and temple service. Death and the afterlife occupied a comparatively bleak place in Sumerian belief, especially compared to the more elaborate afterlife traditions of some other ancient cultures. The underworld, ruled by Inanna's sister, was generally described as a shadowy, dust-filled place where the dead existed in a diminished, joyless state, regardless of how virtuously or wickedly they had lived. A genuinely somber outlook that may help explain why Sumerian literature focused so intensely on achieving fame, building lasting monuments, and being remembered by later generations, since an actual pleasant afterlife was not something most Sumerians expected to receive. Gilgamesh's own desperate quest for immortality and his ultimate acceptance that no such thing was available to him reflects this worldview almost perfectly. A civilization that took its gods extremely seriously while still nursing a very human anxiety about what actually happened after death. Alongside their religious framework, Sumerian scribes developed a mathematical system that would quietly outlive their entire civilization by thousands of years. Rather than counting purely in tens the way most modern systems do, Sumerian mathematics relied heavily on a base of 60, a system whose practical convenience came from how easily the number 60 divides evenly into smaller whole parts, making calculations involving fractions considerably simpler for merchants, builders, and astronomers alike. That same base 60 system is the direct ancestor of the 60 seconds in a modern minute, the 60 minutes in a modern hour, and the 360 degrees used to measure a full circle, meaning that anyone glancing at a clock or a compass today is, in a small but genuine way, still using a piece of Sumerian mathematics devised along the banks of the Euphrates well over 4,000 years ago. With this religious framework in mind, the political history of Sumer starts to make a different kind of sense. A ruler's legitimacy was never simply a matter of military strength. It depended on maintaining the favor of gods who could, according to belief, withdraw their support at any moment and hand kingship to an entirely different city instead. And according to the Sumerians' own account of their history, that is exactly what happened after the world's first great catastrophe, when kingship once again descended from the heavens onto a city near the crossing point of two great rivers, Kish and the kingship that fell from the sky. According to the Sumerian king list, after a great flood swept across the land and wiped away nearly everything that came before it, kingship descended from heaven once again and settled upon a city called Kish. Whether or not an actual flood of that scale really happened is something scholars still debate, though there is genuine physical evidence of significant flood layers at several Mesopotamian sites. Thick bands of water-deposited silt sitting between older and newer layers of settlement, suggesting that some kind of catastrophic flooding really did leave a lasting impression on the people who survived it. Whatever the truth behind the myth, the belief itself mattered enormously to the Sumerians. Kish became associated with a kind of political legitimacy that other cities were eager to claim for themselves, and for centuries afterward, ambitious rulers across the region used the title King of Kish as a way of announcing that their authority stretched beyond their own city's walls, even when they had never physically set foot in Kish at all. The king list describes an entire era before this flood, populated by a handful of cities, Eridu among them, ruled by kings whose reign lengths stretch into the tens of thousands of years, a detail that immediately signals to modern readers that this portion of the list belongs more to sacred tradition than to anything resembling straightforward historical record-keeping. A separate but closely related tradition, preserved in the story of a man named Ziusudra, describes a single righteous individual warned in advance of the coming flood by a sympathetic god, instructed to build a large boat and preserve his family and a selection of living creatures aboard it before the waters rose to cover the land for what the text describes as many days and nights. This same basic flood narrative, with different character names attached, reappears in later Babylonian versions of the Gilgamesh epic, and many centuries afterward in traditions familiar to a much wider portion of the world, suggesting that whatever real climatic event or events lay behind the original Sumerian story left an impression durable enough to echo across thousands of years and across entirely different cultures and languages. The city itself sat further north than Uruk or Eridu, closer to where the Tigris and Euphrates ran nearer to one another, a location that made it a natural crossroads for trade and, less happily, for invasion. Kish grew wealthy off this position, its markets filled with goods moving between the northern hill country and the southern marshlands. Its early kings, some of whom appear in the king list with reign length so long they clearly belong more to legend than to history, were remembered as founding figures of a political order that the rest of Sumer would spend the next several centuries either honouring or trying to overthrow. One of the more grounded and historically plausible figures associated with Kish's early power was a king named Etana, remembered in later legend for a fantastical tale involving a flight on the back of an eagle in search of a plant that could cure his childlessness. Strip away the fantasy, and what remains is a portrait of a real anxiety that would have haunted any ancient ruler: the fear of dying without an heir, of a dynasty ending before it had properly begun. Kish's kings, whether mythical or historical, were remembered less for their military conquests and more for representing something foundational, a kind of first draft of what political power in Sumer would come to look like. The story of Etana's flight is worth lingering on a moment longer because of how strange and gentle it is compared to the violence that fills so much of the rest of Sumerian history. According to the tale, Etana first rescues an eagle that had been trapped and left to starve at the bottom of a pit as punishment for eating the young of a serpent it had sworn to leave alone. Grateful for its rescue, the eagle agrees to carry Etana on its back up toward the heavens in search of a plant capable of granting fertility to his wife. The two rise higher and higher, the earth shrinking beneath them until it looks, in the poem's own description, no larger than a small round loaf of bread floating on the sea before the surviving portion of the story breaks off, its ending lost to time along with countless other fragments of Sumerian literature that simply did not survive the intervening 4,000 years. Later, Assyrian scribes, working many centuries after the original Sumerian version had first been composed, copied and adapted the Etana story for their own libraries, suggesting it remained popular and meaningful across an enormous span of Mesopotamian history, even as the political landscape around it changed almost beyond recognition. Some of these later versions appear to suggest Etana's quest ultimately succeeded, hinting that the story did eventually resolve with the fertility plant being found, though the fragmentary state of the surviving tablets means historians cannot say this with complete confidence. Either way, the story's endurance across so many centuries, copied by scribes who themselves lived closer in time to us than they did to Etana's own supposed reign, speaks to just how deeply this small, strange tale of a king and a grateful eagle had embedded itself into the broader cultural memory of the entire region. Archaeologically, Kish has proven to be an unusually rich site, home to two large mounds excavated separately by different teams over the past century, revealing palace structures, temple remains, and a striking number of burials that give historians a clearer sense of daily material life than many other Sumerian cities can offer. Its location along one of the natural crossing points between the Tigris and Euphrates made it enormously valuable for controlling the movement of goods and armies alike, a blessing during peaceful centuries and a curse whenever larger powers to the north or south decided that whoever held Kish effectively held the gateway to the entire southern plain. As the centuries wore on, Kish's dominance did not go unchallenged. Cities to the south, Uruk chief among them, began to grow strong enough to ignore Kish's claims to seniority, and the relationship between the two cities alternated between rivalry and uneasy cooperation. At one point, later tradition remembered a conflict between a king of Kish and the city of Uruk, one that Uruk's own rulers eventually won, shifting the political center of gravity southward for a time. Kish never fully disappeared from relevance, though. Its symbolic weight as the place where kingship first touched the earth again after the flood meant that for a very long time, no ruler in Sumer could feel truly secure in his power without at least gesturing toward Kish's legacy. Physically, Kish endured for an extraordinarily long time, far longer than many of its rivals, in part because of its strategic position along key trade and military routes. It would go on to be ruled by local Sumerian dynasties, then later come under the control of larger empires that rose in the region, its temples repeatedly restored by rulers eager to be associated with its ancient prestige. Sargon of Akkad himself had once served within Kish's royal court before striking out to build his own empire, and later, both Akkadian and three rulers continued to invest in the city's temples, understanding that Kish's ancient religious prestige remained valuable political capital even long after its own kings had stopped ruling independently. Excavations at the site have uncovered evidence of continued building and habitation stretching across nearly the entire span of Mesopotamian history, making Kish one of the longest continuously significant urban centers anywhere in the ancient Near East, even though it would never again match the political dominance it had briefly held in the earlier centuries after the flood. But prestige is not the same as safety, and a city sitting at a crossroads is a city that every passing army eventually notices. In the centuries after the flood myth, as more Sumerian cities grew wealthy and confident, competition over farmland, water rights, and trade routes intensified across the entire plain, and no city felt this pressure more directly or fought over it more fiercely than one located along a contested strip of territory just south of Uruk, a city called Lagash, whose kings would leave behind some of the most detailed and, frankly, some of the most brutal records of warfare that survive from the ancient world. Lagash and the endless war over a line in the dirt. Lagash was never quite as famous in later memory as Uruk, or as symbolically important as Kish, but in terms of surviving evidence, it may actually be the best documented city-state of early Sumer, and its records reveal something the myths tend to smooth over: how genuinely brutal the competition between neighbouring Sumerian cities could become over what, from a distance, looks like an almost absurdly small piece of land. The trouble began over a strip of fertile farmland called the Gu-Edena, situated between the territory controlled by Lagash and the territory controlled by its neighbour, Umma. Both cities depended heavily on irrigation agriculture, and both needed as much productive farmland as they could hold to feed their growing populations. The Gu-Edena sat right on the border between them, watered by a canal that both cities relied upon, and for generations it became the single most contested piece of ground in the entire region. Around 2500 BCE, a king of Lagash named Eannatum decided to settle the matter with force, launching a campaign against Umma that he would later commemorate on one of the most remarkable surviving artifacts from ancient Sumer, a large carved stone monument now known as the Stele of the Vultures. The stele shows Eannatum leading a tight formation of soldiers, shields locked together, spears extended in unison, marching in step over the fallen bodies of their enemies. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the earliest known depictions of organised infantry warfare anywhere in the world, predating similar tactics associated with much later civilizations by well over 1,000 years. Vultures are shown carrying away the heads and limbs of the defeated, a grim detail that gives the monument its modern name and that leaves little room to romanticize what this conflict actually cost the people who fought and died in it. Eannatum's own inscriptions describe piling up burial mounds for the enemy dead, so large that they stood as a lasting warning to Umma's people never to cross the border again. He forced Umma's ruler into a treaty, marked the boundary with inscribed stone markers, and even claimed that the gods themselves had witnessed and blessed the agreement, a common tactic among Sumerian kings who wanted their political victories treated as sacred rather than simply the outcome of superior force. The stele itself was recovered broken into several separate fragments, excavated years apart, and only later identified as pieces of the very same original monument, and its surviving sections are now held far from the plain where Eannatum once marched his soldiers over the bodies of Umma's defeated army. The treaty terms recorded on the stele are surprisingly specific for a document this old, describing not just where the new boundary line would run, but also naming the particular gods invoked as witnesses to the agreement, including deities associated with both Lagash and Umma, a detail meant to bind both cities to the settlement through shared religious obligation rather than through Lagash's military strength alone. Eannatum's inscriptions also describe imposing a tax or tribute obligation on Umma going forward, along with an agreement that a specific strip of land immediately along the border would remain permanently unfarmed, functioning as a kind of buffer zone meant to keep the two cities' irrigation systems from ever tangling into disputed territory again. Reading these terms today, it is striking just how closely they resemble the language of border settlements from far later periods of history, evidence that the basic diplomatic vocabulary of formal treaties, witnessed agreements, tribute, and buffer zones was already fully developed in Sumer well over 4,000 years ago. But treaties sealed by conquest rarely stayed intact for long in this part of the world, and the peace between Lagash and Umma proved just as fragile as every other truce recorded in Sumerian history. Within a generation or two, Umma's rulers had begun encroaching on the disputed land again, diverting water from the shared canal, pushing boundary markers, testing how much Lagash's weakened successors would tolerate. The conflict simmered on and off for decades, flaring into open war more than once, each side accusing the other of having broken sacred oaths, each side calling on their patron gods to justify renewed violence. It is a pattern that would repeat itself again and again across Sumerian history. A war ends. A monument gets built to declare the matter settled forever, and within a lifetime the same border is bleeding again. What makes the Lagash and Umma conflict so unusual from a modern historical standpoint is simply how well it is documented compared to almost any other regional dispute of its time. Successive rulers of Lagash commissioned inscriptions specifically to record the history of the border conflict for future generations, essentially producing an official, if heavily one-sided, historical archive of the dispute stretching back multiple generations. These records describe earlier kings, predating Eannatum, who had already fought over the same strip of land, meaning that by the time of the Stele of the Vultures, the conflict over the Gua Denna had likely already been simmering for the better part of a century. Eannatum himself is remembered not only for his victory over Umma, but for campaigns against several other neighbouring territories as well, at times claiming authority that stretched briefly toward Kish and even Uruk, suggesting that for a short window, Lagash under his rule may have rivaled any other city-state on the plain in terms of raw military power, even if that dominance never solidified into anything as lasting as later empires would achieve. His successors struggled to maintain what he had built. Some ruled competently, continuing temple construction projects and maintaining the uneasy peace with Umma, while others left far less impressive records behind, a reminder that Sumerian dynasties, much like royal families in almost every era of history, rarely produced a string of equally capable rulers generation after generation. By the time Uruk-agina came to power, Lagash had cycled through enough kings, some remembered fondly and others barely remembered at all, that his emphasis on internal reform rather than renewed war against Umma may have reflected a genuine sense that the city needed to look inward and repair itself before it could hope to compete externally again. Eannatum's dynasty eventually gave way to new rulers in Lagash, and one of the last and most fascinating of them, a king named Uruk-agina, took the throne around 2380 BCE under very different circumstances than his warlike predecessors. Rather than launching campaigns against Umma, Uruk-agina focused inward on what he described as deep corruption within Lagash's own administration. His inscriptions describe officials who had been taking advantage of ordinary citizens for years, seizing property under false pretenses, demanding excessive fees for basic services, and burdening the poor with debts they could never hope to repay. Uruk-agina claimed to have cancelled these unjust debts, restrained the power of grasping officials, and restored what he called the divine order of fairness that had supposedly existed under the city's earliest rulers. Some historians consider his reforms among the very first recorded attempt at social and legal reform in human history, an early argument that a ruler's legitimacy depended not just on military victory, but on how he treated the least powerful people under his authority. It is a genuinely touching detail buried in otherwise violent history, the idea that even amid centuries of border wars and burial mounds built as warnings, someone in Lagash paused to ask whether the ordinary farmers and labourers of the city were being treated fairly by their own leaders. Uruk-agina's inscriptions go into remarkable specifics about the abuses he claims to have ended, describing officials who had previously taken boats, animals, and even the fish caught by ordinary fishermen without any payment, priests who had extracted fees from grieving families simply for permission to bury their dead, and a system of taxation that had grown so bloated with unofficial fees and demands that ordinary households could barely keep enough grain to feed themselves through the year. He describes restoring what he called the ancient way of Lagash, framing his reforms not as a new invention, but as a return to a purer, more just order that had existed under earlier, more honourable kings, a rhetorical move that many reformers throughout history, long after Sumer had vanished, would come to rely on in their own turn. Sadly, Uruk-agina's reforms came at almost exactly the wrong moment, and his own account of Lugal-Zagyesi's later assault on the city makes for genuinely difficult reading, describing the invading forces setting fire to the palace, plundering the treasury of the goddess Bau, and carrying off silver and precious materials that had taken generations to accumulate within Lagash's temple estates. Urukagina's own inscriptions frame the attack explicitly as an offense against the gods rather than simply against himself personally, insisting that he himself had done nothing to deserve such devastation and that responsibility for the destruction rested entirely with Lugal-Zagesi, a plea for historical vindication from a ruler who clearly understood, even as his city burned, that how this moment was remembered mattered every bit as much as how it was survived. What became of Urukagina himself afterward is not recorded in any surviving source, one more small, quiet loss among the many larger losses this era produced. Lagash's old rival Umma was about to be led by a king unlike any Umma had produced before, a man who would not simply push a boundary marker a few meters into disputed farmland, but who would go on to claim, for the first time in recorded history, that he had brought the entirety of Sumer under one single ruler. Umma's moment of glory and the man who nearly unified Sumer. For generations, Umma had existed largely in Lagash's shadow, remembered mostly for losing wars over the Gut Adena and for the humiliating burial mounds Eannatum had left as a warning along their shared border. Umma's own earlier rulers had tried repeatedly to reverse that imbalance in the decades before Lugal-Zagesi came to power, with at least one earlier king reportedly bribing officials within Lagash's own administration to look the other way, while Umma quietly pushed its irrigation canals further into the disputed farmland, a slower, subtler strategy than open warfare, but one that Lagash's kings eventually noticed and punished all the same. This long grinding history of Umma testing its neighbours' patience through small provocations rather than open battle helps explain why, by the time Urukagina came to Lagash's throne focused on internal reform rather than external war, Umma's rulers may have sensed an opportunity that had never quite presented itself before. That changed dramatically under a ruler named Lugal-Zagesi, who came to power in Umma around 2340 BCE and who would go on to achieve something no Sumerian king before him had managed. Lugal-Zagesi's early reign followed a familiar pattern at first. He picked up the old grudge with Lagash, and this time, rather than a limited border skirmish, he launched an outright devastating assault on the city, one that Lagash's own scribes described in genuinely heartbroken terms. Temples were burned, statues of the gods were carried off, and the sacred precincts that generations of Lagash's kings had maintained were left in ruins. It was, by the standards of the era's own writers, an act that shocked even people accustomed to regular warfare between neighbouring cities, precisely because it targeted religious sites that both sides typically treated as at least somewhat protected, even during conflict. But Lugal-Zagesi did not stop at Lagash. Over the following years, he expanded his authority outward in every direction, eventually claiming control not just over Umma and the ruins of Lagash, but over Uruk itself, which he made his capital, and reportedly over a stretch of territory extending from the Persian Gulf all the way up toward the Mediterranean coast, an almost unimaginable scale of control for any single Sumerian ruler up to that point. His own inscriptions describe the god Enlil, the chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon, granting him kingship over the entire land, unifying the many city-states of Sumer under one authority for what may have been the very first time such a thing had ever happened. For a brief window of time, Lugal-Zagesi stood as arguably the most powerful man in the entire world. It is worth pausing on just how remarkable this shift must have felt to people living through it. For as long as anyone could remember, and for as long as their grandparents and great-grandparents could remember before them, the story of Sumer had been one of fiercely independent cities, each with its own patron god, its own king, its own army, and its own long list of grievances against its neighbours. The idea that a single ruler, and one from Umma of all places, a city that had spent generations losing wars to Lagash, could suddenly claim authority over the entire plain, from the marshes near the Gulf to territories far to the north, would have seemed almost as unbelievable as the old myths about kingship descending from the sky. Lugal-Zajezi's own boasts describe roads being made safe for travellers from one end of his territory to the other, and rivers running with what he called pure water in every direction he controlled, poetic language meant to convey a sense of peace and order, finally settling over a land that had known almost nothing but fragmented, competing city-states for its entire recorded history up to that point. That window closed with startling speed. Far to the north, in a region the Sumerians considered less sophisticated than their own ancient cities, a man of comparatively humble origins had been quietly building his own power base. His name was Sargon, and later legends claimed he had been abandoned as an infant, set adrift on a river in a basket of reeds before being rescued and raised by a gardener, a story so similar to tales told about other famous figures in later history that scholars have long debated how much of it reflects genuine biography versus a kind of standardized origin myth for self-made rulers in the ancient world. Whatever the truth of his early life, Sargon rose to serve as a cupbearer to the king of Kish before eventually seizing power for himself and founding a new city called Akkad, whose exact location remains one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of Mesopotamian archaeology to this day, since no one has ever definitively located its ruins. Rising from cupbearer to conqueror of the known world is the sort of trajectory that would sound implausible in almost any other historical context, and it is worth remembering that a cupbearer in a royal court of this era was not a minor servant, but a position of real trust and proximity to power, someone responsible for the king's own safety against poisoning, often drawn into the inner circles of palace politics as a result. From that position, Sargon appears to have built a loyal following, possibly among soldiers and administrators disillusioned with the existing order at Kish, before breaking away entirely and establishing Akkad as a new base of operations. His early campaigns focused on securing control over the northern reaches of Mesopotamia before he ever turned his attention southward toward the wealthy ancient cities of Sumer proper, meaning that by the time he faced Lugal-Zajezi, he was already leading a battle-tested army accustomed to victory, while Lugal-Zajezi's forces, however impressive their recent unification of Sumer had spent more of their energy on political consolidation than on the kind of sustained military campaigning that Sargon's rise had demanded. Sargon's ambitions matched and ultimately outmatched Lugal-Zajezi's own. He marched south, and in a confrontation that effectively decided the fate of Sumerian political independence for generations, he defeated Lugal-Zajezi in battle. Later inscriptions describe Sargon parading his defeated rival through the streets of the sacred city of Nippur in a wooden neckstock, a humiliation meant to demonstrate beyond any doubt that the era of Sumerian city-states acting as fully independent powers had come to an end. What happened to Lugal-Zajezi afterward is not recorded with any certainty in the surviving sources, though the neckstock display at Nippur's most sacred gate, deliberately chosen as the site for his humiliation given the city's religious significance to every Sumerian ruler, suggests Sargon wanted the entire region to understand precisely whose favour now determined who could rule and who could not. Lugal-Zajezi's brief, brilliant unification of Sumer had lasted only a matter of years before it was swallowed whole by an even larger and more ruthless ambition. Itself, the very city whose sudden rise under Lugal-Zajezi had briefly reshaped the entire political landscape of Sumer, found its moment of glory ending almost as quickly as it had begun. Once Sargon's authority was firmly established, settled into the same subordinate status as every other conquered Sumerian city. Its brief unification of the plain remembered mostly as a stepping stone toward Akkadian dominance rather than an achievement that brought the city any lasting advantage. Lagash, for its part, continued on in a diminished but stable form under Akkadian oversight, its temple estates still functioning, its scribes still recording administrative details, even as ultimate political authority now resided far to the north in a capital city whose exact location remains lost beneath the sands to this day. What followed was not simply the fall of one city or one king, but the beginning of an entirely new political reality for every Sumerian city we have discussed so far, and several we have not yet reached. Sargon did not stop with Uruk. He turned his armies against every major city on the plain, one after another, in a campaign of conquest so thorough that it would reshape Mesopotamia for the next several centuries and give rise to what many historians consider the world's very first true empire. Before we follow that empire's rise and fall, it is worth stepping back from kings and armies for a moment to picture what everyday life actually looked like for the ordinary people living inside these city walls while all of this history was unfolding around them. Ordinary life along the rivers. For all the drama of border wars, royal reforms, and shifting empires, the vast majority of people living in any Sumerian city spent their days occupied with much more immediate concerns: growing enough barley to last through the year, keeping their small mud brick homes in reasonable repair, and raising children who might, with some luck, grow up to inherit a stable trade or position within the temple or palace economy. Houses in most Sumerian cities were built close together along narrow, winding streets, constructed from sun-dried mud brick that required constant, ongoing maintenance against the effects of weather, since a single hard rain could soften and damage walls that had taken considerable labour to build in the first place. Wealthier households might include a small interior courtyard used for cooking, socialising, and even burying deceased family members beneath the floor, a practice that kept ancestors close to the family both physically and spiritually, in a culture that placed genuine importance on maintaining a connection with those who had died. Diet across Sumer depended heavily on barley, used to bake bread, and just as importantly, to brew beer, which functioned as a genuine dietary staple rather than a simple luxury consumed by essentially everyone regardless of social status, including as part of standard worker rations recorded in countless surviving administrative tablets. Dates, onions, garlic, and a variety of vegetables rounded out the typical diet, supplemented with fish from the rivers and marshes, and on more special occasions, meat from sheep or goats. Wool production occupied an enormous portion of the Sumerian economy, with temple and palace workshops employing large numbers of women specifically to spin and weave textiles that were then traded across considerable distances, making cloth one of Sumer's most significant exports throughout nearly its entire history. Much of this daily life depended on technologies that Sumerian cities either invented outright or refined more thoroughly than any earlier society had managed. The wheel, used first for pottery production and later adapted for transportation, appears in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia remarkably early, allowing carts to move goods across the flat plain far more efficiently than pack animals alone could manage. Bronze, produced by alloying copper with tin, both of which had to be imported from considerable distances since neither metal occurred naturally within Sumer's own borders, gradually replaced simpler stone and copper tools across the region, improving the effectiveness of everything from farming equipment to weapons. Sailing boats, built from wooden planks or bundled reeds, depending on the era and the resources available, carried goods along the rivers and out into the Persian Gulf, connecting Sumerian cities to trading partners as distant as the Indus Valley civilization to the east. None of these innovations belong to any single city alone, but the dense competitive network of urban centers packed along the Tigris and Euphrates created exactly the kind of environment filled with skilled craftsmen, ambitious merchants, and administrators eager to record and improve upon existing methods, where this kind of steady technological refinement could flourish generation after generation. Family life followed patterns that would feel simultaneously familiar and quite foreign to a modern audience. Marriages were typically arranged between families, often sealed through formal contracts that specified property arrangements and obligations between the two households involved. Women in Sumerian society held a range of legal rights that varied somewhat by city and by era, including the ability in many periods to own property, engage in trade, and, in certain circumstances, initiate divorce proceedings of their own, though real power within most households and most public institutions still rested predominantly with men. Some women achieved genuine prominence beyond the household, serving as high priestesses, as we saw with Enheduanna at Ur, or as skilled scribes and administrators within temple bureaucracies that required literate, capable staff, regardless of gender. Inheritance customs generally favoured sons, though surviving legal texts describe daughters receiving a dowry at marriage that functioned in some sense as their share of the family estate, along with provisions in many contracts ensuring a widow could continue living in the family home and drawing on its resources even after her husband's death, rather than being left with nothing once her children took formal control of the property. Disputes among siblings over an inheritance appear repeatedly in surviving court records, suggesting that squabbling over a parent's estate was every bit as common a source of family tension in ancient Sumer as it remains in households everywhere today. Households typically extended across multiple generations living under a single roof or within a shared family compound, with children expected to help with household and agricultural tasks from a young age, learning practical skills directly from parents and grandparents long before any formal scribal education, if it came at all, ever began. Adoption was a recognized and reasonably common legal practice, with surviving contracts describing arrangements where a childless couple formally adopted an heir, sometimes an adult already established in a trade, specifically to ensure someone would care for them in old age and properly maintain the household's religious obligations after their deaths, a concern that reflects just how seriously Sumerian families took the ongoing relationship between the living and the recently deceased. Health and medicine in Sumerian cities blended what we might now separate into distinct categories of practical treatment and religious ritual. Surviving medical tablets describe remedies made from plants, minerals, and animal products applied to specific ailments, alongside incantations meant to address the belief that illness could also stem from the displeasure of a god or the influence of a malevolent spirit. Physicians occupied a respected, specialized profession, and some surviving legal texts even address questions of medical liability, describing compensation owed to a patient if a physician's treatment caused harm rather than benefit, an early and genuinely striking precedent for the kind of professional accountability that would take many later civilizations far longer to formalize into law. Disputes among ordinary citizens, whether over property, debt, marriage, or inheritance, were generally settled before local courts made up of city elders or officials appointed by the temple or palace, with surviving trial records showing witnesses called to testify and both parties given the opportunity to state their case before a ruling was issued. These court records, preserved on clay tablets much like everything else in Sumerian administrative life, describe genuinely mundane disputes that would feel entirely familiar to anyone navigating a small claims court today, arguments over an unpaid debt, a boundary between two neighbouring properties, or an inheritance dispute between siblings following a parent's death. Far removed from the grand narratives of kings and conquest, these small, ordinary disagreements, and the careful, methodical way Sumerian society worked to resolve them, offer some of the clearest evidence available that beneath every dramatic collapse and every celebrated conquest, life for most people in these cities was defined largely by the same practical, everyday concerns that occupy ordinary people in any era of human history. It is against this backdrop of ordinary, largely unchanging daily life The same bread baked, the same beer brewed, the same barley harvested, year after year, regardless of which king currently claimed divine favor, that the dramatic political upheavals of Sumerian history actually took place. Kings rose and fell. Empires expanded and collapsed. Cities burned and were rebuilt. But for the farmer tending his irrigation ditch, or the weaver at her loom, the deeper rhythm of daily survival continued largely unbroken beneath all of it, interrupted only when war, invasion, or catastrophic administrative collapse reached far enough into ordinary life to disrupt even that most basic, most stubborn continuity. And it was precisely that kind of disruption, on a scale Sumer had never quite experienced before, that was about to sweep down from the north in the form of a single, extraordinarily ambitious former cupbearer and the empire he built in his own name. The Akkadian storm and the silencing of Sumer's kings. Sargon's conquest of southern Mesopotamia unfolded with a speed and thoroughness that must have felt, to the people living through it, like witnessing the end of an entire world. City after city that had spent centuries jealously guarding its independence, fighting brutal wars over border canals and disputed farmland, found itself suddenly answering to a single distant ruler whose capital lay in a region many southern Sumerians would have considered foreign territory only a generation earlier. Sargon's own inscriptions boast that he defeated the city of Uruk and tore down its walls, the very walls that generations of poets had celebrated as Gilgamesh's eternal monument, then went on to defeat Lagash, and reportedly reached all the way to the shores of the Gulf, washing his weapons in its waters as a symbolic claim that his authority now stretched from one end of the known world to the other. The sheer number of individual battles Sargon's inscriptions claim credit for is itself striking, describing dozens of separate engagements fought across the southern plain within what appears to have been a fairly compressed span of years, suggesting a campaign of relentless, methodical conquest rather than a single decisive confrontation deciding everything at once. Each defeated city, according to these accounts, was made to formally submit before Sargon's authority was considered secure, a process that would have required not just battlefield victory, but the deliberate, humiliating dismantling of each city's own claims to independent legitimacy, tearing down walls, removing or replacing local rulers, and requiring public acknowledgement that authority now flowed from Akkad rather than from any local patron god acting alone. This was something genuinely new in human history. Earlier conflicts between Sumerian cities, however brutal, had generally been fought between roughly comparable rivals, cities of similar size and culture squabbling over land and prestige. Sargon's empire was different in scale and in kind. He didn't simply defeat rival kings and extract tribute the way Lugal-Zaggisi had briefly managed to do. He installed his own officials and even members of his own family to govern conquered cities directly, most famously his daughter, Enheduanna, who became high priestess of the moon, god Nanna, in the city of Enheduanna herself deserves particular attention because she is the earliest author in all of human history whose name we actually know. Her hymns and poems, composed in devotion to the goddess Inanna, survive on tablets copied and recopied for centuries after her death, making her not just a political figure installed to secure her father's empire, but genuinely one of the first individual literary voices to ever be preserved for later generations to read. Enheduanna's position in was a deliberate act of statecraft as much as religious devotion. Placing his own daughter at the head of one of the most sacred institutions in the newly conquered south gave Sargon a direct personal foothold within Ur's religious establishment, while also binding his family's legitimacy to the goddess and temple traditions the Sumerians themselves held most dear, rather than positioning Akkadian rule as something entirely foreign imposed from outside. Enheduanna's own compositions describe a period of personal turmoil, including at least one occasion when she describes being driven out of her temple during a local uprising against Akkadian authority, only to be restored to her position afterward, suggesting that even with the family of the emperor himself installed in positions of religious power, the South never fully accepted Akkadian rule without resistance simmering somewhere beneath the surface. Her hymns to Inanna describe the goddess in language of overwhelming, almost frightening power, and later generations of scribes across Mesopotamia continued copying her work as a model of devotional poetry for well over 1,000 years after both she and the empire her father built had passed into history. Her most celebrated surviving work describes her own personal appeal to Inanna during the period when she had been forced from her temple, expressing genuine anguish at her exile and pleading for the goddess to restore her rightful position, blending deeply personal emotion with formal religious devotion in a way that feels remarkably intimate for a composition this old. She also compiled a lengthy collection of hymns addressed to the various temples of Sumer and Akkad, effectively creating one unified religious literary work that honoured the sacred sites of both the newly conquered South and her father's northern homeland together, a subtle but meaningful act of cultural unification carried out through poetry rather than through the sword. Later generations of scribes continued copying and studying her compositions for so long, and with such consistency that fragments of her work have been recovered from multiple different sites across Mesopotamia, written by scribes working many centuries after her own lifetime, a genuinely remarkable testament to how deeply her voice resonated across the subsequent history of the entire region. Beyond Enheduanna, Sargon's administrative innovations reshaped how power functioned across the conquered cities more broadly. Rather than allowing each city to continue operating as a fully self-contained unit, answering only nominally to a distant overlord, Akkadian governors were installed with real authority to collect taxes, organize labor, and maintain order on behalf of the central crown, supported by a standing military presence that could respond quickly to unrest. Trade networks that individual Sumerian cities had once negotiated separately and often competitively were now folded into a single imperial system, allowing goods to move with a degree of ease across the region that earlier, fragmented city-states had never been able to achieve on their own. One of Sargon's own inscriptions boasts, with obvious pride, that ships from distant lands called Dilmun, Margan, and Meluha docked at the quays of Akkad itself, a detail that gives modern historians a genuinely useful window into just how far Akkadian trade networks reached. Dilmun is generally identified with the island region around modern Bahrain, a trading hub that had already connected Sumer to the wider Gulf for centuries. Magan is thought to correspond to territory around modern Oman, valued especially for its copper. Meluha, the furthest and most exotic of the three in Akkadian sources, is widely believed by scholars to refer to the Indus Valley civilization far to the east, meaning that under Akkadian rule, goods and perhaps even travelers moved along trade routes stretching from South Asia all the way to the heart of Mesopotamia, a genuinely staggering distance for any trade network to cover during this period of history. For the ordinary residents of cities like Lagash, Umma, Uruk, and Kish, life under Akkadian rule brought real material benefits alongside the obvious loss of political independence. Trade routes expanded further than ever before, reaching toward what is now Turkey, Iran, and possibly even further afield, bringing in metals, stone, and luxury goods that flowed through the empire's new unified infrastructure. Sargon's grandson, a king named Naram-Sin, pushed the empire's reach even further and, in a break from tradition that must have startled his subjects, had himself declared not merely a king appointed with divine favour, but an actual god in his own right, worthy of his own temple and his own cult of worship. It was an extraordinary claim, one that even Sargon himself had not dared to make, and it suggests just how much the old assumptions about the proper limits of royal power had shifted under Akkadian rule. Naram-Sin's military record does at least partly explain why he may have felt entitled to make such a claim. His inscriptions describe victories against a coalition of rebellious cities that rose against him early in his reign, a revolt so widespread that later tradition remembered it as involving the vast majority of the empire's territory rising up simultaneously against Akkadian rule. Having crushed that rebellion, he went on to campaign successfully against peoples in the Zagros Mountains to the east, against territories to the north in what is now Syria and southeastern Turkey, and reportedly as far as parts of the Arabian Peninsula, an extraordinary geographic reach for any single ruler of this era. A famous stone monument commemorating one of his mountain campaigns shows him standing considerably larger than any other figure in the scene, wearing a horned helmet, a symbol otherwise reserved exclusively for depictions of the gods themselves, trampling the bodies of his defeated enemies while his own soldiers look on from below. A visual statement of divine kingship every bit as bold as his written inscriptions claimed. Yet even at what appeared to be the very height of Akkadian power, cracks were already forming. Naram-Sin's own inscriptions describe having to suppress rebellions across the empire, uprisings by cities that had never fully accepted foreign rule and that seized every opportunity to test whether Akkadian control was truly as absolute as it claimed to be. Later Mesopotamian tradition, looking back on this period, developed a haunting explanation for what happened next, one preserved in a text known as the Curse of Akkad, describing how Naram-Sin's arrogance, including an act of violence against one of Nippur's most sacred temples, brought down the wrath of the god Enlil upon the entire empire, cursing it with famine, invasion, and total collapse. Whatever combination of internal rebellion, external invasion, and simple administrative overreach actually caused it, the Akkadian Empire did indeed collapse within a few generations of reaching its greatest extent, sometime around 2150 BCE. Later Sumerian tradition blamed the final blow on an invasion by a people called the Gutians, described in later texts in strikingly harsh terms as a chaotic, destructive force sweeping down from the eastern mountains, though modern historians suspect the reality of Gutian rule was probably less catastrophic and more complicated than the deeply biased later Sumerian sources make it sound, since those sources were written by the very people who eventually overthrew Gutian influence and had every reason to make their predecessors look as barbaric and illegitimate as possible. The Curse of Akkad text itself deserves a closer look because of how vividly it captures the way later Sumerians made sense of such a total, unexpected collapse. It describes the once magnificent city of Akkad, its granaries overflowing, its harbours filled with ships from distant lands, its streets so prosperous that even the elderly and the sick wanted for nothing, all of it undone after Naram-Sin's forces damaged the sacred temple of Enlil at Nippur during a moment of impious rage. In the poem's telling, Enlil responds by summoning down a coalition of mountain peoples upon the land, described as moving like a flood across the fields, so that grain stopped growing, fish stopped filling the rivers, and the great cities that had once flourished under Akkadian rule were reduced to a state where even the temples themselves fell silent and empty. Whether or not the actual historical Naram-Sin ever committed such an act of sacrilege, the story reveals how deeply the Sumerians associated any great imperial collapse with a failure of proper religious devotion, a pattern of thinking that would recur again when later generations tried to explain the fall of Ur as well. Archaeological evidence for the period following Akkad's collapse does show genuine disruption, including a marked decline in long-distance trade goods appearing in the region, and some evidence of climatic drying that may have made agriculture considerably harder to sustain across parts of Mesopotamia around this time, adding a layer of environmental hardship to whatever political and military turmoil the Gutian incursions brought with them. For roughly a century, the historical record for southern Mesopotamia grows notably thinner and harder to interpret, a sign that whatever central authority had once organized detailed record-keeping across the region had broken down substantially, leaving fewer administrative tablets behind for later archaeologists to find. What matters most for our story is what happened after the Gutian period faded, because out of that chaos, one Sumerian city would rise again, not through the ambitions of a single conquering warlord this time, but through a ruler determined to restore order, rebuild what had been broken, and construct something so physically massive that its remains still dominate the landscape of southern Iraq to this very day. Before that ruler ever took the stage, though, one of the most quietly remarkable figures in all of Sumerian history was already governing Lagash during these very same uncertain decades, a ruler named Gudea, who took power sometime around 2144 BCE. Unlike Eannatum or Lugal-Zarghezi before him, Gudea left behind almost no record of military conquest at all. Instead, his legacy rests almost entirely on an extraordinary building program, particularly the reconstruction of Lagash's great temple to the god Ningirsu, known as the Eninu, described across a series of surviving inscriptions in loving, exhaustive detail, down to the specific types of wood, stone, and precious metal imported from distant lands specifically for its construction. Gudea also commissioned an unusually large number of statues depicting himself, carved from imported diorite, an extremely hard dark stone that would have required enormous skill and effort to shape using the tools available at the time. Roughly 24 of these statues survive today in varying states of completeness, making Gudea one of the best physically represented rulers from the entire span of ancient Sumerian history, his calm, seated likeness instantly recognizable in museums around the world, even to people who have never studied Mesopotamia in any depth. The inscriptions carved into these statues describe his building projects in remarkable detail, including an account of a dream in which the god Ningirsu himself appeared to Gudea and instructed him on the temple's proper design, a detail that framed the entire massive undertaking as an act of direct divine communication rather than simple royal ambition. Securing the raw materials for this kind of construction required trade connections stretching remarkably far beyond Lagash's own borders. Gudea's inscriptions describe cedar timber brought from mountains to the northwest, diorite quarried from distant lands to the southeast, and gold and precious stones acquired through trading contacts reaching toward Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, evidence that even during a period when no single Sumerian ruler controlled a vast territorial empire, individual cities like Lagash still maintained the kind of long-distance trading relationships that had connected Sumer to the wider ancient world for many centuries already. Gudea's peaceful, prosperous reign, sandwiched between the chaos of the Gutian period and the eventual rise of III, stands as a genuine reminder that not every notable Sumerian ruler is remembered for war and conquest. Some, like Gudea, left their mark instead through patient devotion to rebuilding what had been lost, a legacy quieter than a burial mound of enemy dead, but in its own way, every bit as enduring. Rises again and builds a mountain to the moon. The city of had existed for a very long time before it ever became the center of an empire in its own right. It had already served as an important religious center, home to the great temple of the moon, god Nanna, and had briefly come under Akkadian control when Sargon's daughter Enheduanna served there as high priestess. But around 2112 BCE, as the last vestiges of Gutian influence faded from the southern plain, a Sumerian ruler named Ur-Nammu managed to unify the region once again, this time founding what historians now call the Third Dynasty of Ur, often shortened simply to Ur III, a period many scholars consider the last great flowering of purely Sumerian political and cultural power, before the region's identity began to blend more permanently with other peoples of Mesopotamia. Ur-Nammu's reign represented something genuinely different from the conquerors who had come before him. Rather than defining his legacy primarily through military triumph, though he certainly did fight wars to secure his territory, he became remembered above all as a builder and as a lawgiver. He commissioned one of the earliest known law codes in human history, predating the far more famous Babylonian laws of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries. Unlike some later legal traditions built around harsh physical punishment for every offense, Ur-Nammu's code frequently prescribed financial compensation for various injuries and wrongs, a system that suggests a surprisingly practical, almost bureaucratic approach to justice for its time, one concerned with restoring balance to a wronged party rather than simply inflicting suffering on the wrongdoer. The surviving fragments of the code cover an unexpectedly broad range of everyday concerns, addressing matters like false accusations, property disputes, the treatment of household servants, and the responsibilities owed between husbands and wives, giving modern historians one of their clearest windows yet into what ordinary social relationships in a Sumerian city actually looked like, beyond the usual focus on kings and wars. The prologue to the code frames Ur-Nammu's motivations in explicitly moral terms, describing him removing corrupt officials, establishing fair weights and measures so that merchants could no longer cheat their customers, and protecting the vulnerable, including widows and orphans, from being taken advantage of by those with greater power or wealth. It is a theme that echoes Urukagina's earlier reforms in Lagash almost exactly, suggesting that this concern with curbing official corruption and protecting ordinary citizens was not a one-time anomaly, but something closer to a recurring ideal that Sumerian kings returned to again and again whenever they wanted to present their rule as just and divinely favored. His most visible and lasting achievement, however, was architectural. Ur-Nammu ordered the construction of a massive step tower at the heart of Ur, a ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana, built from an almost unbelievable quantity of mud brick, its lower levels faced with fired brick set in bitumen to protect against weathering. The structure rose in receding terraces, each one accessible by monumental staircases, culminating in a shrine at its summit that only the highest priests were permitted to enter. It would have been visible from a remarkable distance across the flat plain surrounding Ur, a deliberate, permanent statement of the city's restored power and its special relationship with the divine. Even now, after more than 4,000 years, a substantial portion of that ziggurat still stands, painstakingly restored in the 20th century, and remains one of the most recognizable monuments from the entire ancient Near East. Ur-Nammu's own reign came to a genuinely striking end. A later composition mourning his death describes him dying on the battlefield, abandoned by the very gods he had spent his life honoring through temple construction and religious devotion, his chariot stuck in the mud of a swamp while his soldiers scattered around him, a strikingly bleak and almost bitter portrayal for a poem honoring a king remembered elsewhere as such a devoted builder and reformer. The lament goes so far as to have Ur-Nammu himself, from beyond death, questioning why a ruler who had done so much to honor the gods should meet such an undignified end. A rare moment in Sumerian royal literature where a king's death is treated less as a triumphant passing into legend and more as a genuinely unsettling, almost unjust turn of fate. Whatever the precise circumstances of his death actually were, the throne passed smoothly to his son. Ur-Nammu's son and successor, a king named Shulgi, inherited a stable and prosperous kingdom and expanded it further, both territorially and administratively. Shulgi's reign, lasting an impressively long 48 years, is remembered as a genuine high point for Ur III, a period of relative peace, extensive infrastructure projects, and a level of bureaucratic record-keeping so thorough that modern historians have access to tens of thousands of surviving administrative tablets from this era alone, documenting everything from grain shipments to temple offerings to the movements of livestock across the kingdom. Shulgi reformed the calendar, standardized weights and measures, built a network of way stations and roads to speed communication and troop movement across his territory, and even composed hymns celebrating his own athletic and scholarly accomplishments, boasting, among other things, of being able to run extraordinary distances in a single day to visit multiple cities and perform religious duties before returning home, a claim historians treat with the same healthy skepticism they apply to most royal self-promotion from this era. These self-praising hymns, several of which survive in reasonably complete form, describe Shulgi as skilled in reading and writing, capable of settling legal disputes with perfect fairness, trained in music and song, and physically powerful enough to outrun any messenger in his kingdom. A portrait that reads less like a modest historical record and more like a carefully composed piece of royal propaganda intended to be copied and taught in scribal schools for generations afterward, reinforcing the king's image among the very officials responsible for running his kingdom day to day. Whatever exaggeration these hymns clearly contain, Shulgi's administrative record does support the idea of a genuinely capable ruler, since the sheer scale and consistency of surviving III bureaucratic archives, covering everything from the health of individual sacrificial animals to the precise travel times between provincial way stations, would have been essentially impossible to maintain without a monarch personally invested in the details of how his kingdom actually functioned. Under Shulgi and his immediate successors, the III state became one of the most tightly organized bureaucracies the ancient world had yet produced, with officials tracking resources and labor across the kingdom in staggering detail, all funneling upward to support the king's court, his temples, and his armies. Some of the surviving administrative archives are almost overwhelming in their specificity, recording the exact number of sheep delivered to a particular temple on a particular day, the rations issued to work crews building canals, and the precise routes taken by messengers carrying official correspondence between provincial centres and the capital. This obsessive record-keeping extended even to livestock destined for sacrifice, with scribes noting the health and condition of individual animals before they were slaughtered for religious ceremonies, a level of bureaucratic thoroughness that would not feel out of place in a modern institution, let alone one operating 4,000 years ago. Shulgi also worked to bind the empire together through marriage alliances and religious patronage, securing loyalty from provincial governors by marrying his daughters into their families, and by personally overseeing the construction and restoration of temples in cities across his territory, ensuring that local elites in places like Nippur, and even more distant provinces had a direct personal stake in his continued success. He also maintained a network of fast messengers and way stations along major routes, allowing information and orders to travel between the capital and its provinces far more quickly than had been possible under earlier, more loosely organized Sumerian kingdoms. Records recovered from some of these way stations detail the rations issued to travelers passing through, along with notes on which official or messenger had passed on which date, offering modern historians an unusually precise sense of just how frequently people and information moved across the kingdom during Shulgi's reign, sometimes multiple messengers passing through a single station within just a few days of each other. There is something quietly remarkable in the fact that by Shulgi's time, Lagash and Umma, the two cities whose generations-long border war over the Gu-Edena had once produced burial mounds built specifically to terrify one another, now existed simply as neighbouring provinces within the very same unified state, their old rivalry reduced to a distant memory recorded mostly in temple archives rather than fought over on any battlefield. Administrative records from this period show grain and labour moving between what had once been these two bitterly opposed territories as part of the same coordinated state economy. a genuinely striking illustration of just how completely centralized authority under III had managed to absorb and neutralize a conflict that had once seemed as permanent and unresolvable as anything in the entire Sumerian world. It must have felt, to anyone living through it, like a return to a kind of golden age, a restoration of Sumerian glory after the disruption of Akkadian collapse and Gutian upheaval. But every golden age we have discussed so far in this story has eventually come apart, and III's fall, when it came, would prove to be one of the most devastating and best documented collapses in the entire history of ancient Sumer, one whose survivors left behind a piece of writing so raw and grief-stricken that it still has the power to unsettle anyone who reads it today. The weeping over, and the end of an age. The rulers who followed Shulgi inherited an empire that looked stable on the surface, but was quietly accumulating pressures that would eventually prove impossible to manage. The third's economy depended on an enormously complex system of centralized control, with grain, textiles, and labor flowing into the capital from across a wide territory, all managed by a bureaucracy that required constant, careful maintenance to function. That system worked well during times of peace and good harvests, but it left the kingdom dangerously exposed whenever conditions turned against it, since so much depended on secure trade routes and stable agricultural output across a very large area. Elam, the kingdom to the east that would eventually deliver the fatal blow, had a long and complicated relationship with Sumer that stretched back many centuries before Ibbi-Sin ever took the throne. Located across the Zagros Mountains in what is now southwestern Iran, Elam had at various points served as a trading partner, supplying valuable stone, metal, and timber that Sumer's flat, resource-poor plain simply could not produce on its own, and at other points had been the target of Sumerian military campaigns, including expeditions launched by both Akkadian and three kings looking to secure those same valuable resources by force rather than trade. Sargon and his successors had campaigned into Elamite territory more than once, and Shulgi himself had married one of his daughters to an Elamite ruler as part of a broader strategy of binding neighbouring powers to through family alliance rather than constant warfare. That same closeness, built up over generations of mixed diplomacy and conflict, meant that Elam understood Ur's internal weaknesses with unusual clarity by the time Ibbi-Sin came to power, having spent decades as both ally and adversary near enough to the Sumerian heartland to watch its fortunes rise and eventually begin to falter. By the reign of Ibbi-Sin, who took the throne around 2028 BCE, those pressures had begun to show. Groups of Amorite peoples, semi-nomadic populations who had been moving into Mesopotamia from the west for some time, were increasingly difficult for Ur's administration to control, and some regions of the kingdom began drifting out of the capital's effective authority, even while nominally still loyal to it. Correspondence from this period, some of it startlingly personal in tone for royal administrative documents, describes Ibbi-Sin's officials in increasingly desperate terms, warning of grain shortages, of provinces failing to send expected tribute, of a kingdom that was fraying at its edges even as its king continued to issue confident proclamations from the capital. One surviving exchange of letters describes a trusted general named Ishbi-Era, originally sent by Ibbi-Sin to secure grain from northern territories during a period of shortage, instead using his position and the resources under his control to carve out an independent base of power for himself at a city called Isin, eventually establishing his own rival dynasty, even while Ibbi-Sin still nominally reigned in Ur. The letters between the two men grow increasingly strained across the surviving correspondence, with Ibbi-Sin alternating between issuing orders as though he still commanded full authority and pleading for loyalty in terms that suggest he understood, at least on some level, just how precarious his position had actually become. Grain prices mentioned in administrative records from this period spiked to levels far beyond anything seen during Shulgi's more stable reign, a fairly direct economic signal that the elaborate redistribution system III had depended on for generations was beginning to break down under the combined weight of political fragmentation and unreliable harvests. Some researchers studying this period have pointed to broader environmental pressures compounding the political troubles Ibn Sina faced, including evidence suggesting a period of reduced rainfall and generally drier conditions affecting parts of the wider region during these very decades, which would have made an already difficult harvest situation considerably worse for a kingdom whose entire economic system depended on predictable agricultural surpluses. A centralized state as tightly organized as III had real strengths during good years, since its bureaucracy could move grain and resources efficiently to wherever they were needed most, but that same tight centralization left it with very little flexibility to absorb a genuine, sustained agricultural crisis, especially once outlying provinces began prioritizing their own survival over their obligations to send resources back to the capital. Then came the blow that would never recover from. A kingdom to the east called Elam, which had a long and complicated history with Sumerian cities, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as rivals, launched a devastating invasion of itself sometime around 2004 BCE. Surviving accounts suggest Elamite forces were joined by additional allied groups from the surrounding region, taking advantage of the fact that Ur's provincial support network had already crumbled to the point where the capital could no longer call on the kind of reinforcements that had protected it during earlier crises. What followed was catastrophic. Ibn Sina was captured and carried off into captivity. The city was sacked, its temples looted, and its population subjected to violence and displacement on a scale that later Sumerian literature would describe in language of almost unbearable grief. The surviving lament tradition describes the invasion unfolding with a speed that left the city's own defenders unable to organize any effective resistance. The great gates giving way, the storerooms and treasuries emptied, and the palace itself, once the administrative heart of an empire that had stretched across the entire southern plain, reduced within a matter of days to a looted shell. Ningal's temple, the moon god Nana's shrine, and the ziggurat that Ur-Nammu had raised generations earlier all suffered damage during the sack, their sacred vessels and statues carried off as spoils of war, an act the surviving poetry treats as almost as devastating as the human casualties themselves, since the loss of a city's cult statues was understood as a genuine severing of that city's relationship with its own patron deity. For a city that had spent nearly a century believing itself the rightful, divinely favoured centre of the entire Sumerian world, that severing must have felt less like a military defeat and more like an act of cosmic abandonment. That literature survives in the form of several compositions modern scholars call city laments, poems mourning the destruction of and several other Sumerian cities in searing, deeply emotional detail. These laments describe the goddess Ningal, patron deity of pleading with the god Enlil to spare her beloved city, watching helplessly as it was destroyed anyway, its people scattered, its temples abandoned to the wind. The imagery in these poems describes streets that once bustled with life left silent, bodies left where they fell rather than given proper burial, and the great ziggurat itself, standing amid the ruin, its sacred purpose violated. It is worth noting gently, given how genuinely difficult this material can be, that these laments describe wartime suffering and loss of life on a massive scale, expressed through poetry rather than graphic historical record, a way for a devastated people to process a tragedy almost too large to comprehend. The lament describes storms as a recurring metaphor for the invasion itself, depicting a literal and figurative storm sweeping over the city, uprooting everything in its path, the the way a real storm might flatten reed huts along the marsh. It describes the abandonment of daily religious offerings, the silencing of temple musicians who had once performed for the gods every single day without interruption, and canals that had been so carefully maintained for generations falling into disrepair almost overnight as the labour force needed to keep them clear simply disappeared. Some killed, some scattered, some no longer willing to work fields they feared would be destroyed again regardless of their effort. The poem also lingers on smaller, quieter images of loss rather than only the grand scale of the destruction, describing abandoned looms left half-finished, storerooms picked clean of grain that families had spent the entire growing season accumulating, and the specific personal grief of individual households mourning members who never returned once the fighting reached their part of the city. A technique that gives the lament an emotional weight far beyond what a simple recitation of destroyed buildings could achieve on its own. Ibbi-Sin himself, according to the lament tradition, was carried away to Elam and never returned. His fate afterward left deliberately vague in the surviving sources, a silence that in its own way feels almost more haunting than any dramatic ending the poets could have invented for him. Other laments composed around the same general period extend this same grief to additional cities across the plain, including Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur, suggesting that the Elamite invasion and the accompanying collapse of Three Authority, brought disruption and hardship to a wide stretch of southern Mesopotamia, rather than remaining confined to Ur's own walls alone. Ishbi-Era, the very general whose earlier disloyalty had helped hasten Ibbi-Sin's downfall, eventually managed to drive Elamite forces back out of the region and established his own new dynasty ruling from Isin, one that explicitly presented itself as the rightful continuation of Ur's legacy, even though actual political and religious authority had now permanently shifted away from Ur itself. This pattern of new dynasties claiming to inherit and continue Sumerian tradition, while power quietly moved elsewhere, would repeat itself again in the centuries that followed, as first Isin, then a rival city called Larsa, and eventually Amorite dynasties at Babylon each claimed to be the true heirs of the ancient Sumerian kings, even as fewer and fewer of their subjects still spoke Sumerian as a language of daily life. The fall of Ur marked in a very real sense the end of Sumerian political independence as a distinct force in Mesopotamian history. Though Sumerian language and culture would continue to be studied, copied, and revered by later Babylonian and Assyrian scholars for well over 1,000 years afterward, treated almost as a classical, sacred heritage, the way later civilizations would treat Latin or ancient Greek, no Sumerian-speaking king would ever again rule an independent empire from a Sumerian city. Power in Mesopotamia shifted decisively northward and westward, toward Amorite dynasties that would eventually establish new centers of authority, most famously at a city called Babylon, whose own rise would come to define the next great chapter of Mesopotamian history, one built quite deliberately on the intellectual and religious foundations that Sumerian cities had spent 3,000 years constructing. Every city we have followed so far, Eridu, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Umma, Akkad, and now met its own particular kind of ending, whether that was a slow fade into irrelevance or a single catastrophic season of loss. But there is one city we have mentioned again and again throughout this story without ever pausing on it directly, a city that somehow managed to matter through every single collapse we have described tonight, without ever once ruling the region itself, and understanding why takes us to the very last chapter of Sumer's long, layered story. Nippur, the city that never needed a crown. Unlike every other city we have discussed tonight, Nippur was never really built around royal ambition in the first place. It had no dynasty of warrior kings comparable to Lagash's Eannatum, no legendary conqueror like Uruk's Gilgamesh, and no empire-building lawgiver like Ur's Ur-Nammu. Instead, Nippur occupied a completely different, and in some ways far more secure, kind of importance across the entire span of Sumerian history. It was the religious heart of the whole civilization, home to the great temple of Enlil, the god the Sumerians regarded as the true head of their entire pantheon, the one who granted kingship itself to whichever city he favored at any given moment. This unusual role meant that Nippur's political fortunes rarely depended on its own military strength, since it had comparatively little of its own to speak of. Instead, its security rested on something arguably more durable across the centuries: the fact that every single ambitious ruler across the plain, whether from Kish, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Akkad, or Ur, needed Nippur's priesthood and Nippur's temple to legitimize their rule. A king could conquer every rival city on the plain through force of arms, but without recognition from Enlil's temple at Nippur, that conquest would have felt hollow and illegitimate in the eyes of the wider Sumerian world. This gave Nippur's priesthood a genuinely unusual form of soft power, a kind of influence that had nothing to do with armies and everything to do with the simple fact that no conqueror wanted to be remembered as the man who had angered the chief god of the entire pantheon. Enlil's temple itself, known as the Ikur, meaning something close to mountain house, occupied a raised terrace at the heart of Nippur and was rebuilt and expanded by a long succession of rulers across nearly every era of Sumerian history, each one eager to add their own name to the temple's long list of royal benefactors. Surviving hymns describe the Ikur in almost overwhelming terms, portraying it as a structure so imposing that its shadow stretched across the entire land, its foundations reaching down into the underworld while its peak brushed against the heavens themselves. Language that reflects just how central this single building was to the Sumerians' understanding of legitimate authority on earth. Priests attached to the Ikur conducted an elaborate calendar of daily and seasonal rituals, and the temple's economic holdings, including farmland, orchards, and herds of livestock donated by grateful or hopeful rulers over the centuries, made it one of the wealthiest single institutions anywhere in ancient Mesopotamia, entirely independent of whichever secular power happened to be dominant at any given moment. Sargon of Akkad, for all his military ambition, made a point of honoring Nippur's temple even as he tore down Uruk's walls and humiliated Lugal-Zaggisi in its very streets. Naram-Sin's later, more troubled reign, according to the Curse of Akkad tradition, only fell apart after he was said to have damaged that same temple, a detail that reveals just how central Nippur's religious protection was considered to any ruler's continued legitimacy. Ur-Nammu and Shulgi both invested heavily in Nippur's temple complex during Ur III's golden years, restoring and expanding it even while their political and administrative capital remained at Ur itself, understanding that true legitimacy in the eyes of the wider Sumerian world still ran through Enlil's house rather than through their own palace. Archaeologically, Nippur has proven to be one of the single richest sites in all of Mesopotamia, in large part because of just how long it remained continuously important across so many different political eras. Excavators have recovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets from the site, an enormous archive covering everything from religious hymns and mathematical texts to school exercises written by young scribes learning their craft, mistakes and corrections still visible in the clay, exactly as their teachers once marked them. These school texts, in particular, offer a strangely intimate glimpse into daily life that royal inscriptions rarely provide, since they capture the ordinary frustrations and small triumphs of children training for a career as scribes, including tablets where a teacher's harsh comments about a student's sloppy handwriting survive next to the student's own attempted corrections, a small, very human detail buried in among the grander religious and political history of the city. Because Nippur's scribes kept copying and recopying texts across so many centuries without interruption, the site has also given historians an unusually reliable way of cross-checking information recorded elsewhere, comparing how the same king, the same military campaign, or the same religious festival might be described in documents produced decades or even centuries apart. This continuity is part of why so much of what we now know about the reigns of Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, and Ibbi-Sin, and about the eventual collapse of Ur III itself, rests so heavily on material recovered from Nippur rather than from Ur's own ruins alone, since Nippur's scribal community kept working, copying, and preserving records straight through a political collapse that had left Ur itself devastated and largely emptied of the very administrators who might otherwise have kept its own archives intact. One surviving composition, likely used as a teaching text for young scribes, describes an ordinary day at one of these schools in remarkably candid terms, following a student through morning lessons, meals, and the ever-present threat of physical punishment from teachers and senior students alike for arriving late, for talking without permission, or for producing sloppy handwriting on a practice tablet. The same text describes the student's father eventually inviting his teacher home for a meal and offering him gifts in the hope of securing better treatment and more attention for his son, a small window into how ancient Sumerian parents navigated the same anxious, hopeful relationship with their children's teachers that families would continue navigating for the next 4,000 years. The curriculum itself progressed in careful stages, beginning with the basic wedge-shaped strokes used to form cuneiform signs, moving on to long lists of vocabulary organized by category, professions, animals, plants, and geographic names among them, before eventually advancing to more complex work involving mathematics, legal formulas, and the copying of literary and religious texts. Mathematical training in particular occupied a significant portion of a young scribe's education, since so much of the profession's actual daily work in adulthood would involve calculating grain quantities, land measurements, and labor allocations using the same base 60 system that governed Sumerian numerical thinking more broadly. Students practiced solving problems involving the division of harvests among laborers, the volume of canals that needed to be dug, and the amount of brick required for a given construction project, practical exercises that mirrored almost exactly the kind of administrative work these same students would go on to perform once they graduated into the temple or palace bureaucracies that employed them. Becoming a scribe was one of the more reliable paths toward a comfortable, respected life in Sumerian society, since literate administrators were needed by temples, palaces, and merchants alike, which meant that the discipline and hardship of scribal school, however harsh it appears in these surviving accounts, was widely understood as a worthwhile investment in a child's future. Nippur's continued relevance long after Ur's fall speaks to something important about how the Sumerians themselves understood the relationship between religious and political power. Cities could rise, conquer, overreach, and collapse, sometimes within the span of a single dramatic generation, but the underlying religious framework that gave their rule meaning in the first place proved to be remarkably resistant to that same kind of collapse. Even as Amorite dynasties took over political control of the region in the centuries after Ur III's fall, and even as the Sumerian language itself slowly faded from everyday speech, Nippur's temple continued to be maintained, its rituals continued to be performed, and its scribal schools continued to train new generations of students in a language that fewer and fewer of them would ever hear spoken outside those very same school walls. What remained after the silence? It would be a mistake to think of Sumer's story ending in a single dramatic moment with the sack of Ur, because the truth is both quieter and in its own way sadder than that. Cities like Nippur, which had never functioned primarily as a political capital, but instead served for the entire span of Sumerian history as its most sacred religious center, home to the great temple of Enlil, continued to be maintained and honored by whatever power happened to control the region. Akkadian, Gutian, III, and later Babylonian rulers alike. Nippur's temple was, in a sense, the one constant thread running through every single collapse we have discussed tonight, a place so central to Sumerian religious identity that no conqueror, however ruthless elsewhere, seemed willing to risk fully abandoning it. Every king wanted Enlil's blessing, and Enlil's house was in Nippur. But even Nippur's continuity could not stop the slow, unglamorous process by which the Sumerian language itself faded from everyday use. As Amorite and other Semitic-speaking populations became more dominant across Mesopotamia in the centuries following Ur's fall, the Akkadian language increasingly became the language people actually spoke in daily life, while Sumerian gradually shifted into something closer to a scholarly and religious language, the way Latin would later function in medieval Europe long after ordinary people had stopped speaking it at home. Scribes in training continued copying ancient Sumerian texts for well over 1,000 years after Sumerian speakers had effectively disappeared as a living population, preserving hymns, laments, proverbs, and legal codes out of genuine reverence for a civilization they recognized, correctly, as the deep root from which their own culture had grown. This is, in its own way, one of the most quietly remarkable facts in this entire story. The cities themselves fell, one after another, sometimes through slow environmental decline like Eridu, sometimes through devastating conquest like Ur, sometimes through the simple erosion of political relevance like Kish. But the ideas that had first taken shape in those cities, writing itself, organized law, monumental religious architecture, epic literature, the basic concept of a centralized bureaucratic state, none of that ever really disappeared. It was absorbed, copied, translated, and carried forward by every subsequent civilization that rose in Mesopotamia's long history, from Babylon to Assyria and beyond, echoing forward through the ancient world in ways that the original builders of Eridu's first small temple could never have imagined. Looking back across everything we have followed tonight, what stands out is just how differently each of these cities met its end, even though every single one of them once believed, in its own moment of greatest confidence, that it would last forever. Eridu simply faded as the water it depended on wandered elsewhere, its temple outliving its population by centuries out of pure religious devotion. Uruk endured wave after wave of conquest and rebuilding, its walls and its legends about Gilgamesh proving sturdier than any single dynasty that ever ruled behind them. Kish held on to symbolic importance long after its political power had genuinely faded, propped up by little more than its ancient association with the very idea of kingship. Lagash and Umma exhausted themselves fighting the same border war for generations, only to be swallowed together by ambitions neither city had ever anticipated. Akkad's empire rose with dizzying speed and collapsed with equally startling suddenness, its very capital city so thoroughly lost that we cannot even point to where it once stood. And having achieved what may have been the most organized, most bureaucratically sophisticated state the ancient world had yet produced, still could not outrun the same basic vulnerabilities, food shortages, disloyal generals, and opportunistic neighbors that had brought down every ambitious kingdom before it. For nearly 2,000 years after the last scribe stopped copying Sumerian hymns at Nippur, these cities and everything that had happened within their walls simply vanished from human memory entirely. The mounds remained, low and unremarkable, scattered across a landscape that had long since been claimed by other peoples, other languages, and other empires, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, and eventually Islamic civilizations, rising and falling across the very same plain without any real awareness of exactly what lay buried beneath their feet. The names Eridu, Uruk, and Ur survived only faintly, filtered through much later religious and historical traditions that preserved fragments of the old stories without any real understanding of the civilization that had first produced them. Buried for 4,000 years. It was only in the 19th century that curious travelers and later trained archaeologists began seriously investigating the low mounds scattered across the plains of southern Iraq, initially uncertain what, if anything, they might find beneath them. Early excavators working through the middle of that century focused mostly on the more famous Assyrian palaces further north, but attention gradually shifted southward as scholars began to realize that these older, quieter mounds concealed something even more ancient and, in some ways, even more historically significant. Digging at sites that would later be identified as Uruk, Ur, and several other Sumerian cities uncovered temple platforms, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, and monumental architecture belonging to a civilization that, remarkably, contemporary scholars had not even known existed. The tablets themselves posed their own enormous challenge. Cuneiform script had to be painstakingly deciphered by generations of scholars working with limited comparative material, a process that unfolded gradually across the second half of the 19th century as more inscriptions were recovered and cross-referenced against each other. A crucial early breakthrough came from a monumental inscription carved high on a cliff face in western Iran, recording the same royal proclamation in 3 different ancient languages side by side, which gave researchers the comparative foothold they desperately needed, allowing progress made in reading one of the 3 languages to gradually unlock the others as well. Sumerian itself, once scholars finally recognized it as an entirely separate and even older language underlying much of the later Akkadian material, presented its own distinct puzzle, since it belonged to no known language family and had no living descendants or close relatives to guide the translation process, meaning its grammar and vocabulary had to be reconstructed almost entirely from internal patterns within the tablets themselves. Once the script finally began to yield its secrets, researchers realized they were looking at something genuinely unprecedented, a written language and an urban civilization considerably older than Babylon, older than the Assyrian empires whose monuments had first drawn European attention to Mesopotamia in the first place, older, in fact, than nearly anything else then known from the written historical record anywhere in the world. Excavations at Ur during the early 20th century, led by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley over the course of more than a decade of careful, methodical digging, produced some of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the era, including a series of royal burials that came to be known as the Royal Cemetery of Ur, containing extraordinarily fine gold jewellery, ornate musical instruments decorated with the head of a bull crafted from gold and lapis lazuli, and, more somberly, the remains of numerous attendants who appear to have died alongside the rulers they served, evidence of funerary practices that remain a difficult and sobering subject for historians studying the period today. Woolley's careful excavation technique, recording the precise position of every object and skeleton rather than simply digging for treasure, set a genuinely important standard for how future archaeologists would approach ancient burial sites, allowing his findings to be studied and reinterpreted by later generations of researchers working with methods and questions he himself could never have anticipated. These excavations, along with parallel work at Uruk, Lagash, and other sites throughout the 20th century, gradually assembled the picture of Sumerian civilization that made this very story possible to tell, piecing it together tablet by tablet, wall by wall, out of ruins that had sat silent and unrecognized for roughly 4,000 years. Work at these sites continued, with interruptions across the following decades, though political instability and conflict in the region have at various points made continued excavation difficult or impossible, leaving significant portions of even well-known sites like Uruk and Kish still only partially explored. Looting during periods of unrest has also cost researchers material that can never be recovered. Tablets and artifacts removed from their original context and sold into private hands, stripping them of the precise archaeological information that gives such objects their real historical value. International teams of archaeologists, working alongside Iraqi antiquities authorities and local specialists who often carry an especially deep personal connection to protecting this shared heritage, have continued efforts in more recent years to survey, document, and where possible, stabilize these sites against further damage, a slow and often difficult undertaking given the scale of the mounds involved and the practical challenges of working in the region. Even with these ongoing challenges, the portrait of Sumerian civilization that has emerged over the past century and a half remains one of the great achievements of modern archaeology, a reconstruction of an entire lost world built patiently out of broken pottery, collapsed mud brick walls, and hundreds of thousands of small clay tablets that generations of scribes never imagined would still be read by anyone 4,000 years after they pressed their reed styluses into the wet clay. Today, the mounds that used to be Eridu, Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and sit quietly under the sun in southern Iraq, some of them still only partially excavated, their full stories not yet completely told even after more than a century of careful archaeological work. Sandstorms still pass over the eroded remains of Ur-Nammu's ziggurat. The marshes that once surrounded Eridu have long since receded, and somewhere in the dry earth there are almost certainly more tablets waiting to be found, more names of forgotten kings, more fragments of laments and hymns, more small human details about a civilization that built the very first cities the world had ever known, watched them rise to heights that felt permanent, and then, one by one, over the span of nearly 3,000 years, watched them fall. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment before we close. Every person who ever walked the streets of Eridu, prayed within the Eanna at Uruk, wept over the ruins of Ur, or copied a hymn to Enlil at Nippur believed, in the quiet, unremarkable way that people in any era believe such things, that their city, their gods, and their own small place within that world would simply continue. None of them could have imagined the 4,000 years of silence that lay ahead, nor the strangers who would one day dig through their broken pottery and half-collapsed walls simply to learn their names again. And yet here we are, still saying those names out loud, still moved by a king's grief over a fallen city, still tracing the outline of a temple built to honor a god of fresh water beside a river that no longer even runs where it once did. That, in the end, may be the truest kind of immortality any of these cities ever managed to find. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.